Hello and welcome to Echoes of an Era. Today we begin an English language course on the history of Ukraine. Our first episode is devoted to Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century and to the impact of the First World War. Before 1914, Ukraine did not exist as an independent state. Ukrainians had no national government, no regular army of their own, no diplomatic service, and no internationally recognized borders. Yet, Ukraine was already becoming an important political question in Eastern Europe. Millions of Ukrainians lived under the rule of two empires, the Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary. They shared cultural traditions and historical memories, but lived under different laws, institutions, and political systems. When the First World War began, Ukrainian lands became a battlefield, a zone of occupation, and a space of imperial rivalry. The war brought suffering, but it also opened the road toward the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917. At the beginning of the 20th century, Ukraine was not represented on the political map of Europe as an independent country. This did not mean that Ukrainians were politically inactive. On the contrary, the Ukrainian national movement was becoming more organized and more ambitious. In the 19th century, much of Ukrainian public activity focused on language, folklore, literature, history, and cultural memory. By the early 20th century, new questions became urgent. Should Ukrainians have their own schools? Should the Ukrainian language be used in public life? Should Ukraine receive autonomy or should Ukrainians seek full independence? These questions transformed the movement. Ukrainian identity was no longer only a cultural revival. It was becoming a modern political project. Most of Ukrainian lands belonged to the Russian Empire. These included Kyiv, Poltava, Chernihiv, Podillia, Volhynia, the Kharkiv region, southern Ukraine, the Donbass, and the industrial centers of the Dnipro region. Western Ukrainian lands belonged to Austria-Hungary. Eastern Galicia and Bukovina were governed from Vienna, while Transcarpathia belonged to the Hungarian half of the monarchy. This division mattered enormously. Ukrainians in Kyiv, Kharkiv, or Odessa lived in a different political world from Ukrainians in Lviv, Chernivtsi, or Uzhhorod. The Ukrainian people were culturally connected, but politically divided. During the First World War, this division became tragic, because Ukrainians were mobilized into opposing imperial armies. Ukrainian lands within the Russian Empire were among the most economically important regions of the state. Ukraine possessed fertile agricultural land, large sugar production areas, coal mines in the Donbass, iron ore deposits near Kryvyi Rih, major ports on the Black Sea, and rapidly growing cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Katerinoslav, and Mykolaiv. Industrialization changed society. Many peasants left villages for mines, factories, railways, and cities. New groups appeared: industrial workers, teachers, doctors, students, journalists, lawyers, and civil servants. These social changes also brought new political ideas. Yet, the Russian imperial authorities generally refused to recognize Ukrainians as a separate political nation, and Ukrainian public activity was often restricted or viewed with suspicion. The Donbass is a good example of the modernizing forces that changed Ukrainian society before the war. Coal, metal, railways, and factories tied the region to the industrial economy of the Russian Empire. Workers came from many places and lived in difficult conditions. Long working hours, danger, poor housing, and social inequality made labor questions increasingly important. For the Ukrainian movement, this industrial world was both an opportunity and a challenge. It showed that modern Ukraine could not be imagined only as a land of villages and folklore. It also had mines, factories, railway junctions, ports, and large cities. Ukrainian politics therefore had to speak not only about culture, but also about workers, peasants, economic rights, and social justice. In Western Ukraine, the situation was different. Austria-Hungary was still an empire, but its political system offered more legal opportunities for national movements. Ukrainians could establish cultural organizations, publish newspapers, create cooperatives, participate in elections, and form political parties. Lviv became one of the most important centers of Ukrainian public life. It was home to newspapers, publishing houses, student organizations, educational societies, and scholarly institutions. Galicia was often seen as a political and cultural base for the wider Ukrainian movement. Yet, life there was far from easy. Ukrainians competed with the politically dominant Polish elite, and social inequality remained deep. The possibilities were broader than in the Russian Empire, but full national self-determination was still absent. Cities such as Lviv and Chernivtsi were not only administrative centers. They were places where newspapers were printed, political ideas circulated, and public organizations met. They connected students, teachers, lawyers, priests, journalists, and activists. In the years before 1914, urban life helped Ukrainian politics become more visible. At the same time, the war quickly changed the atmosphere of these cities. Streets that had once carried students, merchants, and trams now also carried soldiers, refugees, wounded men, and military officials. War did not arrive only at the front. It entered city life, public space, and daily routines. Bukovina had a special place in this story. Its capital, Chernivtsi, was a multicultural city and an important administrative, educational, and commercial center. Ukrainians, Romanians, Jews, Germans, Poles, and others lived in the region. The diversity made Bukovina a vivid example of the borderland character of Ukrainian history. The province lay near the border zones of Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, and Romania. During the war, this location became dangerous. Chernivtsi and Bukovina changed hands several times, and each change of power brought new rules, new suspicions, and new demands on the population. At the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainian society was changing rapidly. Railways connected villages with cities, industrial centers, ports, and foreign markets. Newspapers carried political news into places where people had previously relied mainly on local conversation. More people traveled, studied, served in the army, worked in cities, or migrated abroad. These processes changed the way people understood the world. Being Ukrainian increasingly meant more than preserving old songs, customs, or folk traditions. It became connected with modern ideas about education, political rights, economic development, social reform, and national representation. By 1914, Europe had become a continent of armed rivalry. The great powers had formed two opposing blocs. On one side stood the Triple Entente, France, the Russian Empire, and Great Britain. On the other stood the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 became the immediate trigger for war. For Ukrainians, the outbreak of war created a painful situation. They did not have their own state. They did not control diplomacy. Yet, their lines lay directly between the Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary. Ukraine became one of the spaces in which the war would be fought. Occupied, and politically contested. When war began, millions of men across Europe were mobilized. Ukrainians were drafted into the armies of the two empires that ruled their land. Most served in the Russian Imperial Army. Others served in the Austro-Hungarian army. This meant that Ukrainians could find themselves on opposite sides of the same front. A soldier from Poltava, Kiev, Kharkiv, or Odessa might wear the uniform of the Russian Empire. A soldier from Lviv, Chernivtsi, or the Carpathian region might wear the uniform of Austria-Hungary. They could share language, memories, and traditions, yet be forced to fight for states that had divided their homeland. For most families, war meant separation, danger, uncertainty, injury, and death. Many people believed that the conflict would be short. Military trains moved through towns and cities. Crowds gathered at railway stations. Families said goodbye to men who expected to return within months. The reality of industrial war was very different. The armies were enormous. Artillery, machine guns, railways, telegraphs, and mass mobilization gave the conflict a scale Europe had never experienced before. For Ukrainian society, mobilization affected every aspect of life. Farms lost working men. Families faced shortages of labor and income. Women, older people, and children took on additional responsibilities. The war quickly transformed civilian life. The outbreak of war forced Ukrainian political leaders to make difficult choices. There was no single Ukrainian position. Some activists in the Russian Empire hoped that political change might still be possible within a reformed Russia. Others feared that open support for Russia would lead to even greater pressure on Ukrainian culture and political life. In Galicia, many Ukrainian leaders viewed Russia as a more immediate threat. They feared that Russian occupation could destroy their newspapers, schools, associations, and political organizations built within Austria-Hungary. This concern led to the creation of the main Ukrainian Council in Lviv in August 1914. Its support for Austria-Hungary was not simple imperial loyalty, but a wartime strategy shaped by limited choices. The central rudder belongs mainly to the next episode, but it is important to mention it here as a result of early developments. The Ukrainian Revolution did not appear from nothing in 1917. It grew out of decades of cultural work, political debates, civic organization, wartime mobilization, and imperial crisis. Many people who joined the movement in 1917 had already been shaped by the pre-war national movement, the experience of war, or the collapse of imperial authority. In this sense, the First World War did not create Ukrainian politics from nothing. It accelerated and radicalized a movement that already existed. In the autumn of 1914, a new Ukrainian military formation appeared within the Austro-Hungarian army, the Legion of Ukrainian Siege Riflemen. Its creation was historically important. Ukrainians had served in imperial armies before, but this formation had a specifically Ukrainian character, with Ukrainian symbols, commanders, songs, and a strong sense of national purpose. Thousands of volunteers applied to join, though only a limited number were accepted. The riflemen were formally part of the Austro-Hungarian armed forces, but many of them saw their service as preparation for a future Ukrainian army. Their significance was therefore greater than their numbers. Before the war, Western Ukraine had already developed youth, gymnastic, cultural, and civic organizations. Among the most important were the siege and social movements. They promoted discipline, physical training, civic responsibility, and national awareness. By 1913, some of these organizations had begun to form rifle units and provide basic military preparation. When the war began, this experience helped create the Legion of Ukrainian Siege Riflemen. The appearance of such a unit showed that Ukrainian political aspirations were beginning to take a military form. It was not yet an independent national army, but it was a powerful symbol of future statehood. The Ukrainian Siege Riflemen entered combat in the Carpathian region. Their early military experience was harsh. They fought in difficult mountain terrain, often in severe weather, with limited supplies and under constant threat from artillery and infantry attacks. One of the most famous episodes of their wartime history was the battle for Mount Makivka in the spring of 1915. The fighting at Makivka became an important symbol in Ukrainian memory. But the history of the riflemen should not be reduced to heroic legend alone. These were young men who lived through exhaustion, fear, illness, grief, and the loss of comrades. Makivka became more than a military episode. It became part of the story Ukrainians later told about courage, sacrifice, and the idea of a national army. The riflemen helped create a distinct Ukrainian military tradition. They connected military service with education, culture, song, memory, and political responsibility. Their experience would later influence the armed formations of the Ukrainian Revolution. At the same time, they remained part of a much larger imperial war in which ordinary soldiers often had little control over the decisions that sent them into battle. This double meaning, national symbolism and human suffering, is essential for understanding them. From the first months of the war, Galicia became a major theater of military operations. In 1914, the Russian army launched a large offensive against Austria-Hungary. Russian forces entered eastern Galicia, captured Lviv, and advanced deep into Habsburg territory. For local civilians, the arrival of armies was not simply a change of flags. Occupation brought requisitions, arrests, censorship, searches, destruction of property, and fear of denunciation. In some regions, villages and towns changed hands more than once. The battlefield entered homes, farms, churches, schools, and streets. The Russian occupation of parts of Galicia and Bukovina revealed how dangerous imperial policy could be for Ukrainian institutions. Russian officials often viewed these regions not as ones with their own Ukrainian political life, but as territories that should be absorbed into a broader Russian imperial space. Ukrainian newspapers, schools, associations, publishing houses, and public organizations faced pressure or closure. Political activists, clergy, teachers, journalists, and community leaders could be arrested, deported, or placed under surveillance. The experience of occupation showed how quickly institutions built over decades could be destroyed when even limited legal protections disappeared. Bukovina suffered heavily because of its borderland position. Chernivtsi changed hands several times during the war. For the people living there, this meant repeated uncertainty. One administration arrived, imposed new rules, demanded loyalty, requisitioned supplies, and punished suspected opponents. Then another army returned, and the process began again. The region's ethnic and religious diversity could become a source of suspicion. War encouraged imperial authorities to divide people according to language, church, or presumed loyalty. The experience of Chernivtsi reminds us that the First World War was also a war of occupied streets, checkpoints, requisitions, and fear. In the spring of 1915, Germany and Austria-Hungary launched a major offensive near Gorlice and Tarnow. The attack broke through Russian lines and forced the Russian army into a large retreat. Galicia and much of Bukovina were gradually retaken by the Central Powers. For military historians, this was a strategic turning point on the Eastern Front. For civilians, it meant another wave of upheaval. The retreating army often destroyed infrastructure, removed supplies, and evacuated institutions. People feared being left behind, accused of cooperation, or caught between retreating and advancing forces. The front moved, but civilian suffering remained. The war produced enormous numbers of prisoners. Captured soldiers were often exhausted, hungry, wounded, and uncertain about their future. Among prisoners from the Russian Imperial Army were many Ukrainians. For Ukrainian political activists, these prisoners became an important audience. The Union for the Liberation of Ukraine supported educational and cultural work in several camps: schools, libraries, newspapers, reading rooms, theater groups, choirs, lectures, and discussion circles. The goal was to help prisoners see themselves not only as former imperial soldiers, but as Ukrainians with their own national interests and political future. The goal was to help prisoners see themselves not only as former imperial soldiers, but as Ukrainians with their own national interests and political future. Even in captivity, identity and politics continued to develop. One of the most tragic consequences of the war was the refugee crisis. As armies advanced and retreated, civilians fled from the front zones. Some left voluntarily, hoping to escape danger. Others were evacuated by military authorities. Still others were forced to move because homes had been destroyed or food and work had disappeared. Refugees carried what they could save: clothing, icons, tools, documents, livestock, and children. For families, displacement meant more than changing location. It meant losing a home, a farm, a school, a local church, familiar neighbors, and the routines that made life possible. Refugees needed food, shelter, medical care, transport, and information. Local authorities, charities, clergy, teachers, doctors, women's groups, and civic organizations all became involved in relief work. The crisis showed how deeply the war affected civilian society. Women often carried the heaviest burdens. They cared for children and elderly relatives, searched for food, waited for news from soldiers, and tried to maintain family life under extreme pressure. It could save lives, but it could not fully repair the loss of home, community, and stability. The refugee experience became one of the defining human dimensions of the war in Ukraine. Railway stations became symbols of the war's human geography. Soldiers departed for the front. Wounded men returned. Prisoners were transported. Refugees waited for trains, instructions, and shelter. Many people traveled for weeks or months. They faced overcrowding, disease, hunger, cold, and uncertainty about where they would live. The First World War made millions of people mobile, but this was not freedom of movement. It was movement caused by fear, violence, and loss. Ukraine once became both a place of departure and a place of transit for displaced civilians. The war also affected regions farther from the most famous battlefields. Podillia, Volhynia, and other Ukrainian territories experienced mobilization, military transport, shortages, and the movement of displaced people. Roads filled with carts, animals, baggage, wounded soldiers, and families trying to escape danger. This constant movement changed the social landscape. People from different regions encountered one another in new circumstances. They heard new political ideas, saw the weakness of state power, and experienced the fragility of imperial order. Displacement was not only a humanitarian crisis, it was also a force that changed how people understood society and politics. Volhynia became especially important during the later phases of the war. The front, military roads, railway lines, and refugee movement all shaped life in the region. In 1916, the Brazil offensive again brought heavy fighting to Volhynia, Galicia, and Bukovina. Russian forces initially achieved major success, capturing prisoners and advancing into territories previously retaken by the Central Powers. But for civilians, the offensive meant another cycle of destruction. Villages that had barely begun to recover were exposed again to shelling, occupation, requisitions, and forced evacuation. By 1916, the war was producing deeper losses rather than decisive peace. By the later years of the war, the economic situation had become increasingly severe. The armies needed enormous quantities of food, ammunition, uniforms, fuel, horses, railway transport, and medical supplies. Governments directed more resources toward the war effort, placing heavy pressure on civilian populations. Food prices rose. Basic goods became harder to find. Farms lacked workers because so many men had been mobilized. In cities, people spent long hours waiting in queues. In rural areas, peasants faced requisitions and shortages of tools and animals. The crisis was economic, political, and moral. The empires demanded sacrifice, but increasingly failed to provide security or hope. During the war, culture acquired a new political meaning. A school, reading room, library, choir, theater group, or newspaper could become a place where people preserved dignity and developed a sense of belonging. This was especially visible among Ukrainian prisoners of war in Austria-Hungary and Germany. The Union for the Liberation of Ukraine supported Ukrainian language classes, libraries, lectures, newspapers, choirs, and theater groups. It would be wrong to romanticize camp life. Prisoners faced hardship, illness, uncertainty, and separation from home. Yet for some, these camps became places where Ukrainian national consciousness developed in new and unexpected ways. Culture became preparation for citizenship. These works offer a useful starting point for anyone who would like to explore the period in greater depth. They examine the political, military, social, and cultural dimensions of Ukraine during the First World War, national identity, wartime diplomacy, soldiers, refugees, prisoners of war, and civilian communities. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.